at a Literary Princess, and today I have another What I Read for my PhD program in English Literature video for you. Today we are talking about the second class that I took in my second semester of my first year. So I took this class along with the Victorian Gothic class in spring of 2020. Yes, right when the pandemic hit. This was contemporary memoirs, and it was listed as an American literature course, but we did read one memoir by a British author, so I don't know what that's about, but okay. Okay, this class. I had some issues with this class. Not grade-wise. Grade-wise, I was fine. My issues largely stemmed from the professor. And I had some issues with how this class was set up, like as in the order that we read the books. And just a lot of stuff was wrong with this class. It was definitely not my favorite, but I did get to read some good books for it. So let's start right off. So for the first class, we did not actually read a book. We read a bunch of articles about different fake memoirs. That was our first discussion of the semester, was fake memoirs. So a lot of these articles centered around James Frey's A Million Little Pieces, which was a book promoted by Oprah that James Frey claimed to have been part of this in prison and part of this 12-step program at a rehab center. And it eventually came out that he'd fabricated very large portions of it. So we were given all these articles about it, along with a few other articles about different fake memoirs. And we're asked to write a response to these articles. Now, mind you, this is without any introduction really to like what the genre of memoir is, what are the staples of it. We haven't even talked about real memoirs yet. So I had a really big problem with starting off this way because it felt like we were being thrown in with no context. I did write a response. It was very short. I titled it, "Where Do We Draw the Line? A Response to Articles on Fake Memoirs." And I was talking about how it's kind of a very thin line in the sand that's easily crossed, because one of the main things with a memoir is it's based on your memories, so it's not always necessarily going to be factually correct. Different people remember things very differently. But there are certain things like fabricating entire years in prison that just like, that didn't happen. You didn't meet these people and you didn't have these conversations. And so kind of, where's the line? I think that some of the article authors were, I guess, putting the line too far in one direction. So to keep from fake memoirs, we need to like, only the truth can be in memoirs. Like, what if Proust hadn't really liked Madeleines, or his favorite cookies had actually been oatmeal raisin instead? And I was like, well, that doesn't really equate, because it doesn't actually matter or change the integrity of the piece of writing. Whereas fabricating whole years in prison does, you know, or changing your race, which is something that one person had done, and like making up a whole story that never happened to you. Like, there's a line, it's a thin line, but there is a line. That was basically my response. And unfortunately, I got rid of all but 2 of these books. So editing Elizabeth has a lot to do, and she's gonna be mad at me. Also, before I go any further, I do want to say, because I hated this class so much, I threw out everything to do with it as soon as I could, which means I don't have the syllabus. So I'm working off of my Goodreads shelf, and like when I marked books as read, this means there are 2 books that aren't in here that we didn't read in full. They were essay collections, and I think they were both edited by the professor, which I have thoughts on, but I don't remember what those were called or when we discussed them, so I'm not going to be talking about those. I'm just going to be talking about the books and assignments that I do have available to me to talk about. So sorry, I dumped all of this in the recycling bin immediately. From there, we moved into our first book of the semester, Lying, a Metaphorical Memoir by Lauren Slater. And so this is an interesting book. It is framed as the story of Slater being diagnosed with and living with epilepsy. Except she might not actually have epilepsy. She might have completely made it up. She might have had, oh my God, what's the name of it? Munchausen's? I don't know how to actually pronounce it, but it's basically where you pretend to have illnesses. So she might have had that. She might just be a pathological liar. And we don't know. She's using the epilepsy as a metaphor. And I didn't like this that much. I think I gave it 3 stars because it was an engaging book. But oh my God, the more I looked into it, because we had to write a paper on this as well, and the more I looked into it, the more pissed off I got, because she makes up a whole person writing an introduction to this book. The introduction is written by this man named Hayward Krieger, who is supposedly a professor at a university who focuses on some stuff. And it turns out he is not a real person. She wrote the introduction herself. And so I actually wrote my paper on that, and I'm super proud of this title because I did real good with this title. Will the real Hayward Krieger please stand up? Critique of authority in the introduction to Lauren Slater's Lying. So when the book was published, naturally people started looking into this Krieger guy and realized he's fake. And then Lauren Slater wrote a letter to the newspaper that published an article about Krieger being fake as Krieger, being like, no, I'm real. And then a bunch of philosophers got in on the joke and decided to just start citing Krieger's essays and works in their own works. So like this fake guy has a bunch of fake publications to his name, and it's super weird. So it like took on this life of its own, which was bizarre and really interesting to look into. I did not like the book though. Oh my God, it just made me so mad. And we talked about this in class, like, is it okay to be using epilepsy as a metaphor for your mental illness or just your pathological lying and your issues? Like, is that okay? And a lot of us felt like, no, that's not really okay to take this issue that real people have and like pretend to have it for your memoir and then be like, it's a metaphor. Like, okay. So once again, our first memoir of the class was not actually real. It was not a real memoir. There was lying involved, and the title tells you that. But I think it was ultimately a really strange choice to kick off the semester like this. And I think I could have seen ending the semester with this, to talk about kind of what you can do with the memoir genre and kind of put it on its head. But to start out with this with no real background knowledge on the memoir genre was really jarring. And I didn't like it. Next up, we read one of 2 graphic memoirs that we read. This is Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant by Roz Chast. So this is following Chast as her parents are getting elderly and are needing more care, and kind of the struggles that came along with it. This was quite funny, kind of paired with a book that we read later on in the semester that I'll talk about in a bit. I gave it 4 stars. As somebody with elderly grandparents, like, I could kind of see some things, especially now looking back on it as my grandparents have gotten more and more elderly. Like, I can see how kind of my mother is taking on the role that Chast took on as kind of a caregiver. So that's very interesting. We had some great conversations about this. Overall, I didn't find it overly memorable. Next, we read what was absolutely my favorite book of the whole class. This is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This is another graphic narrative. It follows Bechdel dealing with the death of her father, as well as finding out that her father was a gay man, and dealing with her own sexuality as a gay woman. So there is so much in this book. I adore it. I love Bechdel's art style. It's just so fun, and I wrote 2 papers on this book, okay? So the first paper I'll talk about now was kind of our midterm paper, and we had to take one of the memoirs we had read and write about it critically, but also interweave some of our own memoir into it. So Bechdel has these sections in here about her writing in her diary as a child and kind of how it showed her OCD that developed. Now, so let's see if I can. So she has bits of her childhood diary, and she got this compulsion to draw this little figure over all the entries and be like, as a shorthand for I think. So Bechdel actually revisited all these old diaries and rewrote and drew everything for the book. And I found that really interesting. So I talked about how Bechdel can find healing through looking back at her diaries this way. And I then looked back at one of my old high school diaries and kind of mused on how can I find healing by looking back at these like almost 10 years later. I actually just reread the paper. I'm like, wow, this is actually not a bad paper. But it was a hard paper to write. Getting the balance between my own memoir and analyzing Bechdel's memoir was a very difficult task. And that was going on right as the pandemic kicked off. So it was not really a great time, but I do love this book so much, and we'll be talking about it more in a minute because I wrote another paper on it. Next book we read was Educated by Tara Westover. This is the story of her. She was raised in a family of survivalists, and it's the story of how she got her education. I remember really liking this. I gave it 4 stars, but I don't actually remember much about it now. And I think I gave it to my mother, maybe. Yes, it's the story of how Westover educated herself so that she could then go to university and gain this knowledge that had been she'd been deprived of as a child. So we also had to write a response to this, but not a response to the memoir, but to the response to the idea of education. Our professor wanted us to write kind of our own memoir of education. And so I wrote an essay about kind of my literature education through my great aunt, who used to give me classics. And I've talked about her quite a bit on this channel. And I was basically talking about how she set me on the path to be in an English literature PhD program. So she was the start of my education, kind of. So that was that. That was actually before the midterm paper. So that was at the beginning of March, and then the midterm paper was mid-March when the pandemic really struck, and we went on spring break and never came back. Next up was the one that I kind of say pairs with Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? This is Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End by Atul Gawande, whose name I probably just butchered. This is a very interesting book, basically about end-of-life care, what are the options, and kind of exploring different stories of different people. And it is, like, there are aspects of memoir in here because Gawande's father was becoming elderly and needed care like this. And that's kind of what kicks off the book. But I would be very hesitant to call this a memoir. I actually wouldn't call it a memoir at all. It's more of like just like nonfiction on medicine and health. Somebody here has it tagged as philosophy, and I think that's actually really interesting. I found this so interesting, and I actually gave it to my mother so that she could read it because, again, my grandparents were entering this stage. And I found it kind of helpful, and I thought my mom might find it even more helpful since she's the one that was looking for assisted livings with them. And it talks about different models of assisted living and what works and why it works. So it was super interesting. I just wouldn't call it a memoir, personally. So I was kind of like, why is this in this class? It was a great book. I'm so glad I read it. I gave it 4 stars, but I was like, I don't know. I would love to know if any of you have read Being Immortal. What do you think? Would you call it a memoir? Would you not? And that brings the question, like, is anything where we bring our own life experience in a memoir? Even if that's not the main focus? Like, I don't know. The next one was Having Faith, An Ecologist's Journey to Motherhood by Sandra Steingraber. And this was a memoir about pregnancy. And it terrified me because it really like goes through every stage of the pregnancy and what she was experiencing, because she was an ecologist, or is, I'm assuming she's still alive. This was published in 2001. I don't remember much about this other than being terrified. As you may have heard in my Victorian Gothic video, I became very checked out by the end of the semester. I was having some family tragedy going on. There was a pandemic. I was living with my in-laws. And classes were on Zoom, and 3 hours on Zoom from, I believe, 4 to 7 o'clock was this class, is really hard. And I checked out of this class considerably sooner than I checked out of my Victorian class because I didn't like it, and I didn't like the professor. So unfortunately, I can't remember a whole lot about this book other than it making me not want to be pregnant. Next up is one that I actually do remember because I led the discussion on it. This is H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald. I adored this. This is the one British memoir that we read, and it follows Macdonald as she is grieving the death of her father and buys a goshawk and begins training it. I loved this. I gave it 4 stars at the time. I think it would probably be 4.5 if I were to rate it now. And it's honestly only not 5 because she has these parts where she interweaves biography of T.H. White, who wrote Once and Future King, into the book. He also wrote a book called The Goshawk about his experiences training a goshawk. So that's why it's there. But I kind of questioned whether it really worked that well. Obviously, I just wanted to get back to Macdonald and her hawk, Mabel. So I led the discussion on this. I had a bunch of discussion questions to bring up with the class. A lot about grief, comparing how this book handled grief to how Fun Home handled grief. There was obviously a lot about animals and human relationships with animals, Macdonald's specific relationship with Mabel. And a bit about she talks about like how every animal book, the animal always dies. So we talked about that a bit. And then about kind of how this book makes us view goshawks, what were our opinions on hawks before that. I actually started the class by showing a clip of McDonald that had been on, I believe, PBS with one of her other hawks, not Mabel because Mabel has passed, but another hawk she was training. And it was very cool. I loved this book. The only reason I don't have a physical copy is I actually borrowed it from my office mate. So she had it on her shelf and I was like, hey, I need that book for next semester. Do you think I could borrow it? And she was like, yeah, of course. And then I didn't get it back to her for like half a year because pandemic. But so I loved this book. It was so great. I was really glad that I got to lead the discussion on it. The last one that we read, and my least favorite of the whole class, was At Home in the World by Joyce Maynard. Joyce Maynard had a relationship with the author J.D. Salinger when she was a 19-year-old college student, and Salinger was a 53-year-old man. So yeah, that's a thing. And so this book is exploring her relationship with him, but also other aspects of her life with her parents, and then later on with her daughter. I hated this. I gave it 2 stars. I will admit I was checked out by this point in the class. I know it. And, you know, my teacup or coffee mug that I was drinking from during some of these Zoom sessions might not have had coffee in it. Just saying. However, I didn't like Maynard's voice. I found her obnoxious. I wasn't interested in her story, like this relationship between a 19-year-old and a 53-year-old. No, I don't want to hear it at all. Leave me alone. So yeah, was not a fan of this. Oh, finally, we had the final project. So during the rest of the semester, we had to pick a critical theory and make a annotated bibliography around it. And we, if we wanted, could then use this critical theory in our final paper. So I had chosen trauma theory. And this was well before the frigging pandemic hit. So I was actually able to get books out of the library. But I ultimately decided I did want to use trauma theory, and I wanted to use it to look at Fun Home, as well as Alison Bechdel's follow-up to Fun Home, Are You My Mother?, which focuses on her relationship with her mother. So the title of my essay was The Drawing Cure, Autography as Scriptotherapy in Alison Bechdel's Graphic Memoirs. So autography is kind of short for autobiography and graphic narrative. So that's what these are. And I was kind of looking at how the act of drawing it out and also the act of recreating scenes for reference shots, because Bechtel actually talks about how she does that. She recreates all the poses herself. So the act of drawing all of this, of retracing her diary entries, of retracing her father's letters, of physically acting out scenes, how this acted as a kind of therapy tool. And I was using Bessel van der Kolk, I believe his name is. I was using some of his theories regarding this, as well as looking at a few other prominent trauma theorists whose names I don't remember, and I can't look it up and hold these books at the same time. Anyway, I really liked this paper. I thought this was a good paper. Like, I look back on this paper and I still think that it's a good paper, which doesn't happen very often. So I was ultimately very proud of this one. Oh, I wrote this great paper for this class. However, And I learned a lot about trauma theory, which I ended up using for my general exams, so that was great. However, a big part of my problem with this class is that everything I learned is because I taught it to myself. So the professor did not give us academic articles about different things within memoir studies or different theories we could apply. And she didn't even really contribute a whole lot to the class discussions. She had different students leading them every time. And if the student didn't take up as the full time with their discussion, which even in a grad seminar, you should not be relying on a student to be facilitating the full 3-hour discussion. You are the professor, you're there for a reason. So if the student finished up, she would either start talking about something completely irrelevant or just, I don't even know. So the result was that in our fun home discussion, she did not use the words gay, queer, LGBTQ, any of that. She never made reference to that, which is just such a blatant disregard of the book's subject that it was really shocking. So yeah, I had a lot of problems with this class. But I got through it, and I feel comfortable saying this because the professor has since retired and is no longer at my institution. But yeah, I had a lot of issues with this class, as well as the professor playing favorites. So she liked me. How could you not? But one of my friends she really disliked immediately because the friend expressed her own dislike of the memoir lying. And then that seemed to kind of prejudice the professor against her, which is stuff that can happen in academia. Fun. So, ending on that rather downer note, that was my contemporary memoir course. Learned a lot about trauma theory because I taught myself trauma theory, and I found Fun Home, which is amazing and everybody should go read. And Ages for Hawk, also excellent. So let me know down in the comments below, have you read any of these? What did you think? What memoirs have you read? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.